Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is April 22nd. On this day in 1993, 18-year-old Stephen Lawrence was murdered in a racially motivated attack in southeast London. His death and the shocking failures of the investigation would become one of the most significant catalysts for change in modern British history. Let's get into it. In the spring of 1993, Stephen Lawrence was 18 years old. He was a bright, ambitious teenager of Jamaican descent. He dreamed of becoming an architect. At the time, he was studying for his A-levels and lived with his parents, Neville and Doreen, and his two younger siblings in Eltham, southeast London. On the evening of April 22nd, Stephen had been visiting an uncle and was heading home. He was with his friend Dwayne Brooks, and the two were standing near a bus stop on Wellhall Road when, according to Brooks, a group of white teenage boys approached them, hurling racial slurs. Before either of them could react, the group attacked. Dwayne ran, assuming that Stephen was right behind him. But in reality, Stephen had been stabbed twice, once in the chest and once in the arm. Despite his injuries, he managed to run more than 100 yards before collapsing. Passers-by tried to help, but his wounds were too severe. And Stephen was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at Brooke General Hospital. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds, but the impact would last generations. Witnesses and community members quickly identified a group of local white teens as the likely attackers. Names like Neil and Jamie Acorte, Gary Dobson, David Norris, and Luke Knight came up again and again. But despite the volume of information pointing toward these suspects, police response was slow. No arrests were made that night. In fact, it would be weeks before any of the suspects were even questioned. Stephen had no links to gangs. He had no criminal record. He was simply targeted because he was Black. And for his family, it quickly became clear that not only had they lost their son, but the system that was supposed to help them had failed too. From the beginning, the Metropolitan Police's handling of the investigation raised serious concerns. Despite receiving multiple tips within 24 hours of the murder, including names of suspects, the police delayed arrests, failed to secure evidence, and overlooked basic investigative steps. The homes of the suspects weren't searched for 2 weeks. And when police finally did search them, they failed to seize critical items like clothing that may have contained forensic evidence. The suspects were known in the area for racist behavior, and there was ample suspicion that the attack had been planned. Yet little was done. Stephen's family, particularly his parents Doreen and Neville Lawrence, refused to stay silent. They challenged the police at every turn, calling out the lack of urgency and professionalism. Over time, their fight gained traction. Public support swelled, but still, the Crown Prosecution Service declined to pursue charges, citing insufficient evidence. So in a rare move, and one that I hadn't really heard of before, other than in America, sometimes if you can't get a lot of headway in the criminal justice system, you can file a civil case, like a wrongful death suit, for instance. But in this case, the Lawrence family launched a private prosecution. The trial took place in 1996, but it quickly fell apart. The judge ruled that key evidence was inadmissible. The accused walked free. In 1997, the Daily Mail newspaper published a front-page headline with the faces of the 5 suspects and the word murderers. It challenged them to sue if the paper was wrong. None of them ever did. Later that same year, the newly elected Labour government ordered a public inquiry. The Macpherson report, published in 1999, was damning. It found that the Metropolitan Police were institutionally racist and had failed the Lawrence family at every level. The report included 70 recommendations for reform, many of which were adopted. From changing the way the police handled racially motivated crimes to reforming the double jeopardy rule. Despite the findings of the McPherson report, justice for Stephen remained elusive. Years passed. The suspects remained free and went about their lives. But in 2005, the legal landscape changed. The Criminal Justice Act of 2003 allowed retrials for serious offenses like murder if compelling new evidence emerged. In 2006, police reopened the case. A cold case review led forensic experts to examine evidence with new techniques. They found a tiny speck of Stephen's blood on a jacket worn by Gary Dobson and a hair belonging to Stephen on clothing linked to David Norris. It was a desperately needed breakthrough. In 2011, Dobson and Norris were charged with Stephen's murder. Their trial began later that year at the Old Bailey. Jurors heard not just the forensic evidence, but testimony about the suspect's racist behavior. They watched covert surveillance footage from the late 1990s showing the suspects using hate-filled language. The defense argued contamination, but the jury didn't buy it. And on January 3rd, 2012, nearly 19 years after Stephen's death, Gary Dobson and David Norris were found guilty. Dobson was sentenced to 15 years and 2 months. Norris received 14 years and 3 months. While this may not seem like a lot of time for such a horrible, hateful murder, these sentences reflected their ages at the time of the killing. They were both juveniles. Though justice had come, it was incomplete. 3 of the original suspects have never been tried and continue to deny involvement. Stephen Lawrence's murder changed Britain. His mother, Doreen, became a leading voice for racial justice. She established the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust, now known as Blueprint for All, which supports young people from underrepresented backgrounds. In 2013, she was made a baroness and entered the House of Lords. In 2018, April 22nd was officially declared Stephen Lawrence Day. It's a day of reflection, education, and action. Schools and communities across the UK honor his legacy by discussing race, justice, and equality. But progress has been uneven. In 2020, the Met announced that this case was being moved to inactive status, meaning that no active leads were being pursued. For the Lawrence family, it was a painful reminder that full justice has not yet been served. Still, Stephen's legacy lives on. He is remembered not only as a victim of a senseless hate crime, but as a young man whose life sparked a movement. His name remains a symbol of the ongoing fight for a more just society. The murder of Stephen Lawrence exposed the deep fractures in British policing and society's approach to race. But it also led to one of the most powerful grassroots movements for justice that the UK has ever seen. And though we remember Stephen because of how his life was taken, we honor him for the light he brought into the world and the change his story helped inspire. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found Stephen's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!